The stones of St. Paul's are flying through the air like grenades. The cathedral has been burning since yesterday, its lead roof melting in rivers of liquid silver down the walls, its ancient timbers feeding a heat so extreme that the stone itself fractures and hurls outward with the force of artillery. The diarist John Evelyn will record it with his hands shaking. The stones of St. Paul's flew like grenades. The air above the city is not air anymore.
God save us!
It is a single continuous arch of fire, curving from the river northward to the walls, a mile wide, roaring with a noise that people describe not as crackling or hissing, but as the sound of the sea, a sustained, oceanic, unstoppable thunder. On the Thames, boats packed with furniture, children and desperate strangers are being pelted with fragments of burning material blown from the western shore. Samuel Pepys, watching from the river on the night of September 4th, will write that the fire makes him weep. Not the heat. Not the danger. Just the sight of it. The sight of a city he has known his whole life, consuming itself in the dark. Welcome to Mystique History. How did one unbothered baker, one night of dry wind, and one catastrophically indecisive Lord Mayor produce the most transformative disaster in London's history? Let me explain. First, understand what London was in the summer of 1666.
Bring out your dead!
The city had just passed through the Great Plague of 1665, a year in which somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people had not survived the pestilence. The streets had only recently refilled.
Are these fish wholesome, Master?
The markets had only recently reopened.
Thomas, you're alive!
Aye, barely.
Londoners who had fled to the countryside had only recently returned to find their city scarred, their neighbours gone, their businesses interrupted.
Good morrow, neighbour.
They were exhausted. They were fragile. And they were living in a city that had not structurally changed since the Middle Ages, a warren of timber-framed buildings packed so closely together that in places, neighbours on opposite sides of a lane could lean from their upper windows and touch. That summer had been one of the driest anyone could remember. The wood was not merely old, it was desiccated, 8 weeks without significant rainfall, waiting.
Make way for the King's messenger!
The summer also brought geopolitical anxiety.
Hold steady, men!
England was fighting the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a costly naval conflict that was straining the treasury and keeping nerves frayed across the city. There had been prophecies circulating for years, some dating back to 1651, that a great catastrophe would befall London in the year 1666, a number whose 3 sixes had always carried an apocalyptic resonance for the devoutly religious. The astrologer William Lilly had published a prediction 15 years earlier describing a great destruction of London by fire. When the disaster came, Lilly was summoned before a parliamentary committee to explain whether he had prior knowledge.
I understand your suspicion, but I swear before this committee...
He had not.
My almanac was writ through celestial observation, not conspiracy.
He had simply understood, as anyone who walked those streets understood, that London was a fire waiting for the right conditions to become permanent. None of this would have mattered if a baker named Thomas Farriner had properly extinguished his oven before going to bed on the night of Saturday, the 1st of September. He was not an ordinary baker.
Is this the full royal...
Farriner was the king's baker, a royal appointment, a man who supplied bread to the Navy during wartime. His shop stood on Pudding Lane, a narrow street running steeply down from Eastcheap toward the Thames, not far from the north end of London Bridge. On the night in question, sometime shortly after midnight, the last embers in his oven ignited a pile of firewood nearby. The fire moved from the wood to the bakery floor, then up into the lower rooms of the building. Farriner woke to smoke billowing under his bedroom door. He and his family escaped through an upstairs window, crawling from their own roof onto a neighbour's, raising the alarm as they went. One person did not follow, the household's maidservant, too frightened to attempt the crossing. She became the first victim of the Great Fire of London, and almost certainly not the last, though the official record would later claim only a handful of lives. Historians have never entirely believed that number.
Yet the fire claims but a handful.
It is simply not credible.
The parish constables were called.
More hands here. We need the fire hooks.
They assessed the situation and said what needed to be said. The adjoining houses had to be torn down immediately to prevent the fire spreading.
Hurry! The wind is turning!
This was standard practice.
The fire falters! We are saved! It's stopping!
You remove the fuel ahead of the flame, you create a gap it cannot cross, and the fire dies for lack of timber.
Pull that structure down now, clear the gap!
It worked. It had always worked.
We need more hooks on this side.
But pulling down houses meant legal liability. The buildings were rented, not owned.
I know not, sir. He lives across the city.
You might try the next district.
The landlords couldn't be found in the small hours. And so the constables summoned Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth, dragged from his bed to stand in the orange glow of Pudding Lane and make a decision. Bloodworth looked at the fire.
Flames are spreading fast.
Pish! It is nothing but a trifling blaze. A woman might piss it out.
He looked at the burning building and the 3 or 4 structures already catching. He said, and this exact phrase has been preserved in testimony, "Pish. A woman might piss it out." He went home to bed. It is one of the most consequential failures of nerve in English history.
Look to the west! The city burns!
While Bloodworth slept, the wind from the east, a persistent, dry, warm wind that had been blowing for weeks, took the fire and ran with it. By 3 in the morning, it had reached the river warehouses on Thames Street.
Abandon the goods, save yourselves!
The warehouses were full of oil, tallow, pitch, spirits, rope, hay, coal and timber. All of it caught. The fire that had been a burning bakery became an inferno. It spread west along Thames Street, carried on the wind, jumping from warehouse to warehouse, leaping the narrow lanes in burning cascades of embers, finding the straw-packed stables, the pitch-sealed rooftops, the dry timber frames of 500 years of medieval construction that had never needed to be anything other than cheap and convenient. Samuel Pepys, 33 years old, a naval administrator of middling rank who would one day be recognized as the greatest diarist in English history, was woken at 3 in the morning by his maidservant Jane, who had seen the glow. Pepys got up, looked out, decided it was far enough away, and went back to bed. He was woken again a few hours later.
More than 300 houses already gone, sir.
Jane reported that more than 300 houses had already gone. London Bridge was threatened.
Consumes all.
To the river, quickly, before the bridge takes flame.
Pepys dressed quickly and went to the Tower of London to get a better view. What he saw from the tower's heights made him take a boat immediately to Whitehall and go directly to the King. Charles II, who would prove to be the most effective responder the crisis found, immediately gave orders for houses to be demolished in the fire's path, the very action Bloodworth had refused in the small hours. He sent Pepys back with those instructions. Pepys found the Lord Mayor later that Sunday morning somewhere in Cannon Street and described him as a man like a fainting woman, with a cloth around his neck, utterly spent, saying only, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me.
Out of the way, we must save what we can. To hell!
I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it."
Again! To the west, quickly! Pull, men, pull! It's moving!
The houses were being torn down with hooked poles and small hand tools. The fire was moving faster than any of it. Monday arrived and the sky above London had changed colour.
Good heavens, look there!
A great column of smoke rose above the city and was visible from the countryside 40 miles away. By afternoon it could be seen from Oxford.
It must be London. God save us, the city is lost.
The fire was now no longer a fire in one location. It was a front, advancing westward on the wind, consuming street after entire street in a progression so swift and so systematic that it seemed to those watching it almost deliberate. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert would later confess to starting it deliberately, a confession almost certainly extracted under duress from a man who was demonstrably not even in London when it began.
He speaks the truth, Master.
He had arrived by ship 2 days after the fire started, which several witnesses confirmed.
The manifest shows.
He was hanged at Tyburn on the 29th of October, regardless.
God save the king!
These records prove his innocence.
After his execution,
God help us, we have executed.
the truth emerged. It didn't matter. It never does. Someone had to be responsible.
And hold the guilty parties accountable.
Someone always has to be responsible. The Worshipful Company of Bakers, the Guild of London's breadmakers, issued their formal apology for the fire in 1986. 320 years late, but the guilt apparently lingered.
1666, and offer this formal...
70,000 people were being made homeless while those arguments were still forming. The evacuation of the city was, by every account, both massive and heartbreaking. The streets leading out through the city gates were jammed with people carrying whatever they could manage: bedding, clothing, account books, the contents of shop counters hastily swept into sacks, children balanced on shoulders above the crowd, bird cages swinging from outstretched arms.
Out for the embers!
The Thames was equally choked.
We must reach the other side!
Every boat that could float was on the water, loaded dangerously with possessions and terrified passengers.
Fire is everywhere!
Samuel Pepys, watching from the river, noted that on every third boat he could see a musical instrument. The small keyboard instruments called virginals, the most prized portable possession a prosperous London family could own, hauled from their parlours and heaved aboard. It is one of those details that makes history suddenly, sharply human.
Push on, quickly! To the river!
By Tuesday, the fire reached the old medieval heart of the city. The Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, the dense parishes of ancient churches that had survived every plague and every political upheaval since the Norman conquest. The Royal Exchange, a building of such commercial prestige that traders from across Europe maintained offices there, went. The Guildhall, which had stood in some form for nearly 300 years, caught and burned. Church after church folded. The fire found St. Paul's Cathedral sometime on Tuesday evening. Old St. Paul's was not the dome we know today. It was a medieval Gothic cathedral, the fourth to stand on that site, ancient and partly decrepit. Its rooftop already in a state of disrepair. Scaffolding had been erected around the base for planned renovations.
The cracks in the transept are critical. We must...
A committee of architects, including, ironically, the 34-year-old Christopher Wren, had recently been tasked with planning its restoration. Wren had surveyed the building only weeks before. The scaffolding caught first. Then the scaffolding spread the fire to the wooden stalls and booksellers' sheds packed against the cathedral's outer walls, where London's trade in books and manuscripts had clustered for generations. The booksellers, in a decision that seemed prudent at the time, had moved their stock into the cathedral's crypt for safekeeping, an enormous quantity of paper and parchment and bound volumes, hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge, trade and literature pressed together underground. They believed stone would protect them. Stone did not protect them. The heat generated by the burning building above was sufficient to ignite everything stored below, without the flames ever having to directly reach the crypt. The entire stock burned. Contemporary estimates put the value of the books lost in the cathedral precinct alone at over £200,000, a figure that, in 1666, represented the kind of wealth that would take a successful merchant a lifetime to accumulate. The lead roof of the cathedral melted and ran down the walls in molten streams that cooled into strange silvery rivulets across the old stonework. The great columns of medieval stone cracked and fractured in the heat. Evelyn's grenades, fragments of ancient masonry hurled outward by the force of thermal expansion, struck the surrounding streets and church walls. The tower fell. The nave fell. By Wednesday morning, there was nothing left of old St. Paul's but the blackened shell of its outer walls, and even those were too damaged to save.
This section is completely compromised.
Indeed. We have no choice but to condemn it.
King Charles II, to his lasting credit, did not watch from a distance.
Pull down that building! Faster!
He appeared personally at the fire line on multiple occasions, passing buckets of water alongside ordinary labourers, directing demolitions, keeping the panic from becoming total collapse.
Clear the road!
His brother, the Duke of York, took effective command of the firefighting effort, organising gangs of men with the military discipline that civilian fire brigades lacked.
Ropes on that building now! And you men, form the line!
The decisive weapon, when it finally worked, was gunpowder.
We must hold this line!
The Navy had stockpiles. The Duke of York authorised their use. Buildings in the fire's westward path were blown apart, creating gaps too wide for even the wind-borne embers to cross reliably. The explosions sent new rumours through the refugee camps outside the city walls. Some in the encampments at Moorfields and Islington convinced themselves that the sounds were Dutch or French artillery, that an invasion was underway, that the fire had been the opening act of a foreign assault. The trained bands and royal guards had to ride into the camps at speed to prevent a complete collapse of order. Wednesday night, the wind dropped. Not through any human effort, not through any act of strategy or brilliance, but simply because the wind, which had carried this fire from a bakery on Pudding Lane into the destruction of 80% of the ancient city, finally grew tired and fell still. The fire, deprived of its engine, began to falter. By Thursday, the 6th of September, 4 days after Thomas Farriner had gone to bed without checking his oven, the Great Fire of London was essentially over. The ground was too hot to walk on for days. The ruins glowed at night. People who tried to pick through the rubble in search of their belongings pulled back burned hands. The Rebuilding Act issued in the following days established that no wooden building could be reconstructed as replacement. All new construction would be brick or stone. Streets would be widened. The riverside would be opened up, its warehouse frontage set back from the water's edge. The chaotic, fire-hungry medieval city was, by legal decree, abolished. 73,000 people needed housing now. Shanty towns of wooden huts and lean-tos sprang up in Moorfields and Smithfield, the great open spaces just north of the city walls.
£10 per annum.
Landlords in the unburned suburbs immediately raised their rents to levels that left the poorest with nothing. A letter written by a Londoner named Thomas Bromfield on the 17th of September recorded that houses in surviving areas were being offered at 10 times their pre-fire price. Samuel Pepys, who had buried his prized Parmesan cheese and his good wine in his garden to protect them from the approaching flames, noted in his diary 5 days after the fire that houses in unburned areas were commanding rents of £150 per year for properties that had previously let for 40. The rich moved to new houses in the unburned west of the city or to the suburbs and never came back. A contemporary writer named Samuel Rolle described wealthy citizens now dwelling in Houndsditch and Shoreditch, places they would previously not have touched, alongside the workers and poor residents those suburbs had always housed. Some of those encampments in Moorfields were still occupied 8 years later, stubborn wooden shelters resisting the legal order that required them to be cleared by 1674. And Christopher Wren went to work. Within days of the fire ending, he submitted to Charles II a complete plan for a new London. Wide boulevards radiating outward from a piazza, a canal to replace the choked and malodorous Fleet River, generous squares and open vistas, orderly Baroque geometry replacing 5 centuries of organic medieval growth. It was magnificent. Charles was enthusiastic. Robert Hooke, Wren's brilliant colleague and one of the founding members of the Royal Society, submitted his own grid-based plan. John Evelyn submitted a third. All of them were magnificent, and none of them were built. The ownership of land in the city was too fragmented, too legally complex, too tangled in the competing rights of thousands of individual landlords, tenants, guilds and institutions for any grand redesign to be imposed. London was rebuilt instead on its own old bones, the same winding streets, the same narrow lanes, the same plot boundaries that the fire had traced so faithfully, just in brick and stone instead of wood, just with wider pavements and open quays, just slowly better. What Wren did build was 52 new churches and 1 cathedral that would become the most recognizable building in the English-speaking world. The new St. Paul's, designed from scratch between 1669 and 1675, and finally consecrated in 1708, rose above the rebuilt city with its great dome visible from every approach, the first purpose-built English Baroque cathedral, a building of such scale and confidence that it made the ruined medieval shell it replaced seem in retrospect merely a rough draft. Wren worked on it for over 30 years. When he was 80 years old, his son carried him up inside the dome so he could see the completed interior. He passed away in 1723 at the age of 90 and was buried in the crypt of his own masterpiece. Inside the cathedral, there is an inscription in Latin placed there by his son after his father was gone.
As you wish, Mr. Wren.
It reads, "Si monumentum requiris circumspice." If you seek his monument, look around you. Look around you indeed. The monument that marks the place where Farriner's oven sparked this whole catastrophe stands 61 meters tall, a height chosen deliberately, because 61 meters is the exact distance from the base of the column to the spot on Pudding Lane where the fire began. If you laid the monument on its side, its top would touch the origin of the disaster. It is a mathematical fact embedded in a stone structure, a precise measurement of grief. Walk through the City of London today, and you are walking through the direct consequence of 4 September days in 1666. The streets follow the same medieval lines. The churches bear Wren's signature in every stone. The building regulations that prevent London from becoming a forest of unbounded glass towers, the protected sightlines that ensure St. Paul's Dome is still visible from Richmond Park, from Parliament Hill, from the green hills of Greenwich, are the living descendants of the Rebuilding Act of 1666. The Great Fire did not end medieval London cleanly. It burned it. And from the ash, something more durable grew. If the history of fire, resilience and cities built from catastrophe is the kind of story that keeps you watching, then subscribe to Mystique History, because this is what we do every single episode. We find the fire beneath the history and let you feel the heat. Hit subscribe and join us for whatever comes next. I'm your host at Mystique History, and I want to know, what historical event should I recreate next? Let me know in the comments. Who in the